Today is the 11th of July, 2017, and this is Athens Speakout, number 408. And the title of this is The American Foreign Policy Toward the Middle East. Now, 2 weeks ago, on the 27th of June, we discussed the first Arab-Israeli War, 1945 to 49. From the point of view of the balance of power, President Truman's decision to recognize the new state of Israel on the 15th of May, 1948, turned out to be more decisive in changing American policy than the press understood at the time. In the November 1948 election, the results were that Truman won in a very close vote in one of the closest elections of all time. By May of 1949, Jewish volunteers, armed forces known as the Haganah, finally forced the poorly armed Syrian, Lebanese, Jordanian, Iraqi, and Egyptian intervening armies and a few Saudi volunteers to surrender. The final results of the War of Independence were that 6,373 Jews were killed, and on the other side, it was estimated that 3,700 to 7,000 were killed among the Arab volunteer armies. Among the indigenous Palestinians, there were between 3,000 and 13,000 deaths in the first Arab-Israeli War. Israel's Arab neighbors on the borders and throughout the extended Arab League of 22 members all pledged never to recognize the independent state of Israel.
So this is where I interrupt you.
Go ahead, go ahead.
And I ask you a question.
Go ahead.
About modern stuff. That was a good summary of what we discussed last time and
fine.
where we were at with regard to the Middle Eastern issue. The question I've got here is, do you have any new information about the Republican senators' tax bills and health care proposals?
Right. And that was my question to you, and you're going to give the answer.
Oh, okay.
And if you don't have much of an answer, I will follow with my comment.
Well, the current status is that Mitch McConnell announced today that they will extend their current session 2 weeks into August, so they won't take their August recess until mid-month. Whether they'll actually be able to get anything done with that extension remains to be seen. I'm dubious that they'll be able to accomplish much.
And I agree with you. They're stalling. The Republicans and the Democrats are stalling.
That's our current events section of the program.
Well, I can add something to this problem. I am quoting the opinion page of a columnist by the name of David Brooks on June 27th, 2017. And the title of his article is "The GOP Rejects Conservatism," New York Times, 27th of June. And this has a dateline of Aspen, Colorado. And Brooks says there is a structural flaw in modern capitalism. The tremendous income gains are going to those in the top 20%, but the prospects are diminishing for those in the middle and working classes. This gigantic trend widens the inequality, exacerbates the social segmentation, and fuels the distrust that led to Donald Trump's election. In my opinion, says Brooks, it looks like the conservative journalist, David Brooks, is moving toward the policy similar to Bernie Sanders, Democratic senator from Vermont, who's on the left. David Brooks used to write on television as a Republican, as a liberal Republican. And David Brooks says conservative intellectuals were slow to understand the seriousness of this structural problem. But over the past 5 years, they have begun to grapple with the consequences. Basically, many conservative intellectuals have come to terms with income redistribution. In effect, David Brooks writes, conservative income redistribution tends to focus on the local level. The Republicans propagate the old free market ideology. Child tax credits, mobility vouchers, and wage subsidies are not following the free market. Conservative redistribution principles extend to the think tanks, and that imaginary consumer-driven health care will provide more universal coverage. For example, the American Enterprise Institute uses tax credits or pre-funded health savings accounts to give middle and working class people less coverage. Conservative policy intellectuals now admit that American society is coming apart.
Can I make a comment?
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I think it's rather late in the day for people like David Brooks to finally be recognizing the devastation they've caused to the American economy over the last 40 years. But if he wants to admit defeat and recognize the damage that they've done and recognize that the left has been right all along as far as these economic principles go, I'm happy to have him join us.
Good.
I do find it a little odd that conservatives like David Brooks want to say, well, now that we've spent the last 40 years ruining the economy, trust us and we're going to fix it for you. I think that anybody who would believe that line is a fool.
Well, he's a little more subtle than that, I think.
Well, yeah, I'm obviously mocking him because I still wouldn't trust David Brooks to park my car as far as economics
Well, he
goes.
is a propagandist. Well, I agree to that. He is a propagandist.
But anyway, so now that they've spent 40 years wrecking the economy, they want us to let them fix it. I think it's a silly argument, but I'm glad that he's on board. Welcome to the party, David Brooks.
Okay, well, you're saying that David Brooks is finally discovering the reality of the working class and middle class.
Yeah.
And I think that's a slight step forward.
Well,
That's better than those Republicans like
it's better than them continuing to deny it, yeah.
the senators and the House of Representatives, Ryan
Right.
and Mitch McConnell.
Yeah, who had Paul Ryan, who used to fantasize at keg parties at Miami of Ohio University about cutting Medicare and Medicaid. Yeah.
Yeah. So he's saying that the Republicans are divided, and he's saying, as a former Republican hack, that he wouldn't mind if Democrats like Bernie Sanders pick up votes in the next election. Don't you think he's implying that?
I think that David Brooks has been in a state of existential crisis for the past year and a half, basically.
That's right.
Ever since Donald Trump announced his candidacy for the presidency.
Well, that's good. So David Brooks continues, and he says, the new Republican Senate bill would eliminate 3.8% of the tax investment income for those making over $250,000. Well, we're not in that class. The Republican health plan would throw 15 million people off Medicaid, and according to the Congressional Budget Office. Now, the Congressional Budget Office is more neutral than either the Democrats or Republican Party hacks. Would you agree?
I would absolutely agree. In fact, the congressional, on Obamacare, for instance, when the CBO rated Obamacare, their predictions proved to be more accurate than any others over the course of the next 7 years to where we are today. The CBO's predictions about what would happen with Obamacare proved to be much more accurate than the Obama administration's itself.
Good.
And so, when the CBO says that under the Senate plan, 23 million people will lose their insurance, $770 billion will be cut from Medicaid, I believe them.
Good.
I believe they're right.
Great, great.
Or they're at least a lot closer than anybody else's predictions would be.
Good. So then going on with this...
and by the way Brooks put that, 3.8% tax elimination, that's a really generous way to put it. The simple terms are this: millionaires and billionaires would get $50,000 tax cuts each.
Good.
Each individual millionaire and billionaire gets a $50,000 tax break. That's more than most Americans make in a year in income.
Absolutely.
They get a nice little tax break.
And
$50,000.
Brooks is part of that class.
Brooks, and he is. He wants to call that 3.8% because it sounds nicer than $50,000 for millionaires and billionaires. But that's what it is.
He's moving there, but he's still a little
They
slow.
want to take health care away from 23 million people to give $50,000 tax cuts to millionaires and billionaires. Don't forget that.
Right. So, what percent of the Trump voters were white?
No, probably 95%, 96% usually.
All right, yeah.
Republicans
and
usually
Brooks,
never
of
get
course,
more than 4%.
Is very white, very upper class.
Yeah.
Uptown New York.
I like to think of him as the premier member of the Young Fogies Club.
Yeah, right.
Inside the Beltway.
Right. So then he talks about Tom Price. He continues that the Health and Human Service Secretary, applauded by Trump, is Tom Price. And Price went to the Aspen Institute, where I guess Brooks was reporting,
that's why his
seminar for the Republicans. But Tom Price had no argument. He filled his time with rising to the top level of vampant generality, in other words, propaganda, that was utterly detached from the choices of the actual legislation. The Congressional Budget Office indicated that the Republican Senate plan would throw off 22 million people off the insurance rolls. Under the Senate bill, under the Senate bill, deductibles for poor families would be more than half of their annual income.
You know, just an observation real quick. Under the first House version plan, 24 million people lost their insurance. Under the second House plan, 23 million people lost their insurance. Under the Senate plan, 22 million people lose their insurance. You know, if they come up with 21 more plans, then we'll be at where we are today. It'll be great. We'll just be at status quo homeostasis. But remember that this is 22, 23, 24 more million people who won't have insurance. We already have about 25 million people who don't have insurance.
Right.
That number used to be about 50 million people who didn't have insurance until Obamacare. That brought the number down to 25 million. Now the Republicans are proposing to bring it back up to 50 million people without insurance in a country of about 320 million citizens.
But so far, nobody's voting for anything.
That's true. And just to put this in perspective, too, 23 million people would be the entire populations of about 16 or 17 middle American states combined. So you take the entire populations of Nevada and Oklahoma and Utah and just take that huge swath of country right there geographically. That's how many people 23 million people is. That's how many people they want to take health care away from.
Right. Well, I have another little article to add to this. Since that time, I have some additional news published in the Athens Messenger on the 29th of June. The headline is no accountability for any of Trump's lies, written by Rex Hoopy of the Chicago Tribune. Now, I like some of his journalism, and Hoopy wants or writes that the President of the United States denounces ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, the New York Times, and the Washington Post as not news organizations. They are fake news, so says Trump. Trump puts his propaganda on Twitter, which I, as a historian, will never read. I read books first, magazines second, newspapers third, and the less TV I see, the better off I am. and Twitter, I don't know what Trump is talking about. That's not social media. I agree that it is anti-social media. And kids just write garbage on there. Okay, so I have a second question for you. Do you have any comment on the latest news and rumors from Syria?
Well, the latest word from Syria is that when at the G20 meeting, Russia and the United States worked out a ceasefire. Now, that ceasefire is held for a couple days. There's been many ceasefires in the past. None of them have lasted very long.
Right.
I don't anticipate that this one will last very long either. Other than that, the situation continues to fluctuate day to day.
Right.
That's about the sum of the latest news that I know.
Okay. Well, there is no doubt that the dictator Bashar al-Assad is a tyrant who has killed many Syrians. Mosul has been captured as of the 10th of July. But the civil war in Syria, in the desert, will continue.
Yes. I don't see an end in sight, really, as far as things go right now, between the rebels fighting Assad and then the ISIS situation.
Now,
it continues to be a very difficult situation in Syria.
Now, I would like to quote a Professor John Mearsheimer from the University of Chicago, and also Andrew J. Bacevich. Bacevich was a colonel who retired in 2003 when George W. Bush invaded Iraq. And he quit the army and said Bush would lose in Iraq. And Bacevich predicted that this war would fail, and he went back to the university and got a PhD in diplomatic history from Princeton. Now, The Nation magazine was hoping in 2016 that if Hillary had won the election, she would recruit Bernie Sanders to the administration. And the two of them might possibly appoint Bacevich as a key spot in the State Department. But since the 8th of November 2016, those optimistic hopes have been dashed, and few people pay much attention to Bacevich's continued criticism of his TV broadcasts. So the HNN History newsletter is where I picked this up, has a little more information about Bacevich in my bibliography. So I will come to another question, question number 3. Do you have any question as to why the State of Israel easily defeated the Arab coalition in the first Arab-Israeli War?
So we're going back to 48 and 49 now?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, it actually starts in 45 at the end of World War II.
Okay, so we're going back to the 40s, though. You don't mean
just
like
summarize
recently.
that war.
Well, I think that it obviously, as you've talked about in the beginning of this episode and through much of the last episode, it had a lot to do with the support that Israel had from a lot of Western countries.
That's true.
I hope that you can elaborate on that
All
because
right.
you know a lot more about it than I do.
Yeah, well, I'll give you some background history. During the first Arab-Israeli War, and continuing for a long time thereafter, the Israeli Labor Party, under the leadership of David Ben-Gurion, became the most important personality as far as the United States press was concerned. David Ben-Gurion became Israel's first premier in 1948 after Truman had recognized Israel as an independent state. David Ben-Gurion was the intellectual father of the first Labor Party government in Israel, with its capital at Tel Aviv from 1948 to 1963, when David Ben-Gurion retired from active politics. Now, Ben-Gurion's attitude in 1948 was that he thought an Arab being killed for every Jew was a horrifying idea. In one word, that's revenge. But by 1945 to 47, the Irgun and the Stern gangs, through a campaign of assassination, had taken control over many Palestinian towns and resettled them with Jewish refugees. In 1945 to 49, American public opinion was more pro-Jewish than in any country in Europe because of the growing financial and voting power of Jewish immigrants to the United States since the 1880s. In the 1880s, in Tsarist Russia, and continuing under Stalin's Russia up to after 1936, Moscow's government discriminated against Jews. Lenin and Stalin, from 1917 to 1936, were very pro-Jewish. If the Jews repudiated religion and joined the atheistic Communist Party.
Was the Stalin regime specifically more anti-Jewish than any other religion? Because it seems to me they were just anti-religion overall.
They were anti-religion.
Yeah, because he wanted the state to be people's religion. He wanted the communist state, the Stalinist state to be the religion.
Let's talk about individual attitudes toward Jews. Every individual has his own opinion of who the Jews are and what they believe, okay? So in 1917, Lenin was a native Russian who joined the Social Democratic Party in exile in Zurich, Switzerland. And Lenin was preaching the ideology of Karl Marx, born Jew, educated at the University of Berlin in philosophy, and Marx was a German atheist. And the Marxist idea spread in Russia faster than any other country in Europe because of the discrimination of the Tsarist government on religious grounds. So that is a gap between Russian society and the societies in the West, and the United States in particular was more pro-Jewish than any European country. Because in the First Amendment, the United States passing the First Amendment saying that Congress cannot establish a religion and cannot limit the free exercise thereof, gave Jews who had settled in America freedom of religion. And George Washington wrote a letter to the rabbi of New York, and there were very few Jews in New York in 1789. And he said, "We welcome the Jewish community to America, and the Jews qualify under the First Amendment and have freedom of religion." That was before the French Revolution.
Okay. Yeah, that was a singular accomplishment in the history of civilization.
Right. So America was more sympathetic to the Jewish plight in the 1880s. And of course, those Jews in the 1880s came to the United States, where they had free land, and they bought up land in Manhattan and became rich and sent their kids law school, banker, rabbi. You had three choices. And the Jews are relatively higher educated than any Catholic or Protestant. They put education first. That is the secret of the Jewish success. Would you agree to that?
So, American public opinion then,
Was pro-Jewish in 1948.
and they accepted, as you say here, accepted Ben-Gurion's government's propaganda line
Right.
that Israel is the only democratic state
That's right.
in the Middle East.
Right, right.
Now, you call that a propaganda line. It was the only democratic state in the Middle East.
Well,
Was it the
who
only?
defines democracy? The French have a slightly different definition than the Americans. And the British have a slightly different definition. And the Republican Party and the Democratic Party have other definitions. And there are conservative Republicans, and there are liberal Republicans. And as we know, the word conservative has about 4 or 5 definitions.
Yeah.
And that was the significance of what David Brooks was saying. He was saying, I'm no longer a conservative, and I'm no longer I'm no longer a political conservative, and I'm no longer a supporter of the GOP, but I am a conservative in one way. He is a conservative literary critic of American Protestant literature. He has read novels like Hawthorne, Moby Dick, English novels, Charles Dickens. So as a TV commentator, Diane, who you know I mean, spoke on television, American University program. Diane Rehm. She said, when I talk to David Brooks, I'm talking to a civilized man, because he is moving to something called Western civilization. And he may be an ethnic Jew, but he's leaving Zionism behind. And he's leaving the Jewish Bible behind. He's not particularly interested in the Jewish Bible. It's antique literature, as far as I know, in Brooks's mind. So that's why I say, is Jewish civilization coming to an end and joining Western civilization? That's the question I'm raising. So the question here is, do you have any comments as to why the state of Israel easily defeated, and that was due to military power and the sympathy of the American government? And during the first war, and continuing for a long time, the Israeli Labor Party, under the leadership of David Ben-Gurion, became a very important personality in the United States. And David Ben-Gurion became the first premier of Israel in 1948, after Truman had recognized the independent state of Israel. Now the propaganda comes, as you say. David Ben-Gurion has great hope in the new democratic state of Israel. But as time goes on, that so-called democracy is getting tarnished. And that's what I recognize. And I think David Brooks recognizes that. That's the progress of these 5 or 6 Arab-Israeli wars. And that's the theme of what we're going to be talking about for the rest of this show. Okay, it's kind of an introduction to
down here.
Yeah, okay. So I think we've more or less summarize that. Now, getting back to 1936 and Stalin. Stalin was a Georgian, not a Russian. His assistant, he was the assistant to Lenin and Trotsky. Now, Lenin, Trotsky, and Stalin were all pseudonyms. Stalin meant steel. Lenin was his natural name. And Trotsky's name was Leon Bronstein, born Jew. And when he left Russia, he settled in Bronx and changed his name to Leon Trotsky. So he had a pseudonym. Now, in 1905...
Wait, before we get to 1905, we need to take a quick station break.
Yeah, we'll slow down.
I'm David DeWitt with the Athens News. I'm
Right.
here with Professor Emeritus from Ohio University, Robert Whaley. We're discussing the history of the Middle East and the Israeli state.
And the attitude of communist Russia toward Jews.
Right.
And Lenin and Trotsky and Stalin in the early years were very pro-Jewish on the assumption that the Jews hated the Tsar and were moving toward socialism or communism. And many Jews in the United States were on the forefront of becoming atheistic. They were departing from the traditional religion faster than Protestants or Catholics. The Protestants, Catholics still looked at the Old New Testament as setting standards. Well, anyway, Trotsky was Trotsky was a Jew, and he became the first foreign secretary of Lenin and helped negotiate the peace treaty with the Germans at the end of the First World War. Now, when Stalin came to power, he didn't immediately execute Trotsky, but he wanted to ease Trotsky out of power because Stalin assumed that Trotsky would be, after Lenin, the second man. But Stalin manipulated the bureaucracy and got the bureaucracy to kind of pass over Trotsky's name. Well, Trotsky then was exiled from Moscow and sent out to Kazakhstan somewhere to live in a place called Alma-Ata, where they used to make films in the desert. And he lived out there from 1922, I would say, 1924 to 26. I think he was exiled in 26. And then in 1936, Stalin changed his mind about atheism because he was confronted with the fact that Hitler was planning and Japan was planning to invade the Soviet Union on anti-communism. So he said, well, this free love thing, no longer possible. And he passed laws toning down his atheism and but he was afraid of Trotsky because Trotsky wrote a underground letter and called it the Fourth International, and was trying to say that Stalin betrayed the revolution. Well, in 1940, when Stalin had made a deal with Hitler over Poland not to get involved in World War II, Stalin made the bold assumption, now's the time to assassinate Trotsky, who was then living in Mexico, because Trotsky was kicked out of Siberia, out of Kazakhstan, and had to go into exile. And he first went to Norway, and then the Norwegian government found him too difficult, and he was sent to Mexico. Now, the Mexicans had a very radical left-wing Marxist government then, under a guy by the name of Cardenas, and he wanted to fight Standard Oil Company and confiscate the oil company and so forth and so on. Well, Stalin had a secret agent who got into Trotsky's headquarters and said he was anti-Stalinist and stabbed Trotsky in the back of the neck in Mexico and assassinated him.
With an ice pick, yeah.
Yeah. And Stalin thought he had gotten away with it. But what he failed to realize is that in 1941, Hitler betrayed him and invaded the Soviet Union.
Right.
So then Stalin makes a 180-degree turn and comes back to the United States and Britain because he needs allies. And he brings guys like Maxim Litvinov, who used to be the foreign minister under the Popular Front government and was purged by Stalin when he wanted to make a deal with Hitler, and brought back and sent as the ambassador to the United States. And then in 1945, he decided that the United States capitalism was the #1 enemy, and he changed his line again. So Stalin was a zigzag diplomat who used Marxist propaganda and called it Stalinism, a new ideology. And his attitude toward Jews went up and down depending upon the vagaries of civil war and revolution. Anyway, some people thought that Stalin was going to purge the Jews again when he died in 1953, because he was saying there's a doctor's plot to get rid of Joseph Stalin. And he was setting the things up for another purge. Stalin died in 1953 under peculiar circumstances. So Stalin believed in the balance of power, but he was a propagandist.
Stalin believed in Machiavelli.
He was Machiavellian, but he was also somewhat of a communist. He wore 3 hats.
Yeah.
He was a communist, he was a czarist, and he inherited the czarist empire, and he was his own Soviet citizen, a new man, Soviet.
Right.
He thought he could integrate 16 nationalities. And the new Soviet Union came apart. So communism had a long, and Stalinism had a long decline. Well, anyway, that's the background to this Middle East problem and the Arab-Israeli wars. And I guess we're up to another page here. I want to say more about Ben-Gurion and Israeli scholars. There were later scholars by the name of Benny Morris who investigated as a historian in a book published in 1987 called The Birth of the Refugee Problem. And Benny Morris exposed the Zionist propaganda of the first Arab-Israeli war and democracy and so forth and so on. And the so-called War of Independence was essentially false. According to Benny Morris and other critics who did this research in the Jewish Agency, in the Haganah, and various terror groups like the Irgun and the Sterndang, of what they did in practice as World War II veterans with surplus arms and military combat experience learned during the first Arab-Israeli War of Independence. So there was informal combat which began in 1945 among various terrorist groups. And Morris concluded that the first War of Independence was over when 700,000 Palestinians were either killed or expelled from their property. Now that kind of information was hidden to the American press and American public opinion. Those are new statistics that were not available in the American press. And that's the importance of Benny Morris's new research. Well, there was a second critic about the War of Independence and pointed out the Israeli government behavior, and his name was Ilan Pappé, PhD from the University of Jerusalem. He was a second critic of the War of Independence and their behavior. And Pappé got his PhD from the University of Jerusalem. He read Hebrew, he read the story, and Pappé showed that in 1948, even on the kibbutzim, who were idealistic social communes, according to Ben-Gurion and the Labor Party, were in fact more like Benny Morris's Irgun Stern gangs. Mm-hmm. And the UN General Assembly voted in 1947 in a resolution called Resolution 194 that the Palestinians had a right of self-determination. At that time, only a few British Foreign Office officials and American State Department officials even read the text of that resolution. The American press totally ignored the concerns of the UN General Assembly's resolution. Historians then, in the 1980s, led by Morris and Pappé, were totally unknown to both the British and American media outlets in the first Arab-Israeli War. And American mass media were also reluctant in the 1880s to broadcast the findings of Morris and Pappé. So the truth is only slowly coming to light. Anyway, weakly armed Arab states, including Egypt, protected the state, or were protected by the state of the British Empire. And Iraq and Transjordan's army made protests against the Israeli behavior at the United Nations. But the Arab governments sent intervening armies to roll back the armed Israeli citizens and the European newcomers. Lebanon and Syria were dominated by the French Empire, and which was still under the control, technically, of the independent states, yet supervised by the UN trusteeships. So Lebanese and Syrians also sent volunteers to resist the new Israeli state. And Ben-Gurion retired from power in 1963 as premier. He was fatigued, yet as a journalist, he continued to criticize the Labor premiers, including Labor's hawkish Prime Minister Golda Meir. And David Ben-Gurion in 1963 founded his own independent splinter party called the Israeli Workers' Party. But later, Ben-Gurion was pummeled in the press by the Israeli press under Menachem Begin's leadership and the right-wing Likud party. So as time goes on, the Jewish democracy is becoming less democratic and more imperial. That's the importance of this research. And Menachem Begin in 1982, before he launched a new war in Beirut, had plenty of military experience as a volunteer in the very first War of Independence. He was a military man himself. Okay, question number 4. Do you have any comments or questions about the importance of the rise and fall of David Ben-Gurion?
No, not specifically, although I think it's significant that he played such a large role, and then the Likud party came along and knocked him out, knocked out his legacy.
Yeah, we're talking about the military.
Immediately.
We're talking about the military versus propaganda.
Right.
And politics, and gentleman's politics. Ben-Gurion was a gentleman.
Do you think his fall from power directly led to the 1967 conflict?
Well, he was getting older.
Yeah.
And meanwhile, there had been a second Arab-Israeli war and a third 1967.
Right.
And the character of Israel was getting more and more imperialistic. So we're going to go into the second and third and fourth war, the war of attrition. Well, no, he retired in 63.
In 63, so
Yeah,
4 years before the third war.
Yeah, right. But he could see the handwriting on the wall. He understood Israeli internal politics. Anyway, you might call him the last liberal of Israel. So anyway, we can go now to the second Arab-Israeli war, if you're ready.
Mm-hmm.
The second Arab-Israeli war is called the Suez Crisis in 1956 in the United States. And the British Foreign Office had made a deal with the Egyptian revolutionary government, General Muhammad Naguib, in 1952. The relatively conservative Naguib had overthrown the Egyptian puppet king Farouk. So Naguib was in position to make a deal with the British Foreign Office. And the British Royal Army made an agreement which retired and the Egyptians could collect the tolls from the canal, but the British Royal Army could keep troops there to protect the free transportation through the canal. But Egypt would get new economic rights from the Naguib government. Anyway, 2 years after Naguib, the Foreign Office made a second deal with a more radical Egyptian, Gamal Nasser, who abolished Naguib's office. And General Nasser proclaimed himself the new president of the Arab Socialist Republic. Nasser also proclaimed himself the intellectual leader of the Arab League. So in response, in 1956, in February of 56, the Israeli government and the French government drew up a military war plan called Operation Musketeer. And Operation Musketeer planned to invade the Suez Canal beginning in October of 1956. Now, the Eisenhower administration was divided between the peacefully inclined president, who wanted to be reelected in November 56 as the peace candidate, because Eisenhower had ended the Korean War in July of 1953, which had been a political stalemate. Now, Secretary of State John Foster Dulles was much more conservative and much opposed to Nasser's Arab socialism, because Nasser had assumed that Egypt had lost the first Arab-Israeli war due to the fact that Great Britain and the United States restricted arms sales to Egypt. Also, Egypt was building a high dam on the Nile River to increase irrigation possibilities, which was subsidized by American foreign aid. Egypt had long been plagued by being overpopulated. So John Foster Dulles, as Secretary of State, wanted to procure Eisenhower's support and join Prime Minister Anthony Eden and lead a three-power war in the expanded Operation Musketeer. Hopefully, the French and the Israelis had been long trying to obtain the British consent to join the French-Israeli plan and make it a tripartite plan. The problem with Operation Musketeer was that from the very beginning, there was no clear political objective of what the three powers would do if the British joined the coalition. Sir Anthony Eden decided to secretly join Operation Musketeer without informing the hesitant Eisenhower administration. So on the 29th of October, 1956, a few days before the November election in the United States, the three powers invaded the Suez Canal. The peace-minded Eisenhower was outraged by Eden's trick and who had joined the Israelis and the French. Instead, Eisenhower joined Nikita Khrushchev of the Soviet Union, and the United States and USSR took the problem to the Security Council members and appealed to the UN Security Council, claiming that the three-power invaders had committed acts of aggression. The United Nations political and U.S. economic action pressured the British and French and Israeli troops to withdraw from the canal zone within 10 days and go back to the status quo antebellum. The Israeli state won no military victory in the Second Arab-Israeli War, but American Jews very seldom ever voted for the Republican Party again. Eisenhower won the 1956 election with about the same majority as he had won in the 1952 election. Question to Dave DeWitt. Do you have any comments or questions about the Suez Crisis and the Second Arab-Israeli War?
Well, I'm curious how the alliance in that situation between the U.S. and the USSR played in American politics.
Eisenhower was the man of the hour.
So everyone just trusted
Eisenhower
him.
was the victor in World War II who had liberated Germany. Eisenhower wrote his memoirs, The Crusade in Europe. Eisenhower was elected the president in 1952 during the Korean War, and he negotiated a ceasefire with Stalin and Mao Zedong to come out of Korea with a stalemate. There were no winners in the Korean War. Mao didn't win, Stalin didn't win, and Dean Acheson, Secretary of State, didn't win. It was a stalemate, status quo antebellum. And the 38th parallel was moved a little bit to the north. South Korea gained a little bit of territory, and they called that the DMZ, the Demilitarized Zone. But neither North Korea or South Korea will recognize each other. And North Korea started out as a satellite of the Soviet Union and moved over to become a satellite of the People's Republic of China.
I see.
Now what are you going to do with North Korea?
So Eisenhower didn't have to pay any significant political price.
He won the Korean War because all the American soldiers wanted to do was get out of Korea. What are we doing in Korea? Why did Truman ever intervene in Korea? And wasn't it fortunate that Eisenhower got out of Korea? So he made his second peace gesture in 1956 by saying, and we're not going to get into any Arab-Israeli war, which was an insult to the Jewish American community because they wanted to keep pushing Zionism and the gains of the Zionist state. So this is why you have a big discrimination, big gap between Democrats and Republicans over the future of Zionism and the Israeli state.
Right, and then eventually in the 70s, the neoconservatives would come along.
Gets up into
And
the
that
South.
has to do with the third one, so we don't want to get into the third.
The third we'll have to discuss not next week. Yeah, next week.
Yeah, next week.
Yeah, but it won't be called, what is it? This is 2000 and, what a show this is called? This is called 2008. It will not be called 2008. It'll be called
408.
No, it'll be called.
So it'll be 409.
No, it'll be 410.
410.
Because tomorrow I'm going to do 409 with my wife
Okay.
on the Civil War.
Oh, great.
So the number jumps a number.
Okay.
Yeah, well, I'm
So
going
we'll
on
come
television.
back next Tuesday for
We'll come back
410.
next thing for 410.
Okay, great.
And thank you for coming. This is called
Athens Speak Out.
Debate is the oxygen of democracy. You and I and most of the Democrats are still interested in debate, including the Jewish Democrats. But I don't know where Trump is moving. Does he accept debate, free press, democracy? What does he really believe?
I think he believes in himself and money.